Hello everybody. In this episode I would like to give you a brief overview of what's happening with the podcast and what the plans are for the future. I'm a bit sick at the moment, so if my voice sounds a little bit different, please forgive me for that. There are some things going on that I'm really excited about, and some of those things that I'll mention are a bit more defined than others, but generally it should provide an overview of where things are standing right now and what's waiting in the future. We'll talk a little bit about where the podcast is standing right now, the shift in focus that's happening, some collaborations that have been getting off the ground, one of which has led to the creation of wonderful music for the podcast, and some of our future plans. If you have any questions as a result of this podcast episode, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll be sure to read them and will get back to you as soon as I can. So, with that out of the way, let's get through the main points. I've made sure to add chapter markers to all the points, so feel free to skip around to the points that you find most interesting. Just in case this is the very first podcast episode you're listening to, and you're wondering what kind of content you can expect, allow me a few minutes to lay it out. Most episodes feature guests with whom we delve into their stories, experiences, or areas of expertise, often in lengthy, in-depth conversations. These conversations typically run for several hours, and in fact, our longest episode to date, which is episode 21, lasted nearly 4 hours and featured a discussion with students that were banned from the Peterson Academy. These conversations are incredibly profound, full of beauty, wisdom, and raw human experience. There's no one topic this podcast focuses on, like a specific branch of science, for example. Instead, the podcast aims to really engage in thoughtful conversation with people who have a unique story to tell and valuable knowledge to share across various fields. Since launching the podcast in July 2024, I've had the privilege of hosting incredible guests from around the world, from the United States and Canada to Russia, Rwanda and Japan. Some recent examples are a conversation I had on episode 18 with Dusty May Taylor, a Canadian woman who grew up in a chaotic and dangerous environment and talks about how she went through that. Another example is my conversation with Max Peck on episode 19, a Marine Corps veteran who served in many places in the world, including in Afghanistan, and in that conversation he outlines his journey through boot camp, going on his first deployment and eventually getting deployed to Afghanistan. And the last example I will mention is the one with Adam Ayala on episode 25. Adam is a psychoanalyst from the United States who talks about the intricate dynamics of empathy and emotional presence, while also unpacking complex concepts like transference and soul murder, which is a concept centered around deliberate traumatization. Aside from these wonderful conversations with guests, the other format that we are running on this podcast are called reflections, like the episode you're listening to right now. And these are shorter episodes without guests, and at this point they don't have recorded video. The 2 reflection episodes that have been published so far are episode 23, titled How Empathy Transforms Our Communication, where we've delved into the scale of empathy and breaking it down to its core definition, the ability to share and understand the feeling of another person. Some techniques that could help you connect more deeply and communicate more effectively were also brought forward. In the second Reflections episode, which is episode 26 and had the title How Video Games Both Enriched and Derailed My Life, I outline my personal 30-year journey with video games, and I share a few nostalgic memories like tinkering with early computers and playing video games on floppy disks, and I also mention a profoundly disruptive event that happened in my early teens. Alright, so those are the 2 formats that we are currently running on the podcast, the regular guest conversations and the reflection episodes. And just to give you some context to what the goal of the podcast is, allow me to give you a little bit of background on that. For me, one of the best ways to go on an adventure is to seek out stories. One of the most wonderful qualities of human beings is our ability to tell stories. We are uniquely capable of sharing narratives from events from a distant past, our own experiences, and those of the people around us. We read books about the great figures of the past, study large historical events in great detail, and can get absorbed in an amazing novel and allow ourselves to be completely immersed in a new television series when it comes out, where the latest episode is always the big talking point of that day at the water cooler. Telling stories allows us to connect, understand each other, and view the world from different perspectives. The more we connect with stories, the more detailed our vision of that which is the human experience becomes. I believe it's one of the most fundamental things a human can do, next to something like loving. And think about this for a second. Have you ever heard someone say they don't love a good story? I love engaging people in thoughtful conversation. It's one of my favorite things to do. Often statements are made, and instead of digging a little bit deeper to see where those statements came from, we assume them to be true and just move on. A very simple but well-known example is a phrase like, hard work always pays off. Sure, okay, but what do you mean by hard work exactly? And does it actually always pay off? And what does paying off mean exactly? By limiting ourselves to a simple and often flawed statement like this, we rob ourselves of our ability to think. Instead, we could ask some questions to see what someone is really thinking when they talk. Not in order to find something to disagree with just to start a discussion, but to genuinely listen to them, figure out what's what, and to find solutions to existing challenges as a result of that collaboration. There's so much we can learn from each other if we just listen. I've always enjoyed having conversation with people, but truly listening is something I've had to practice, and have been practicing for a long time. I also knew that I wanted to do something with my voice, and I know it sounds arrogant to point this out myself, but I often heard people say that I should be on the radio, or even ask me flat out if I already was. And then they give me a blank stare when I reply, no, but thank you for the wonderful compliment. I've also considered voice acting for a short while many years ago, specifically because of my love for video games and imitating certain characters from them. One of my favorites are the orcs from Warcraft. All of these were just loose ideas with no specific aim or method of combining them into a clear goal. Around the time the COVID-19 pandemic started, I picked up listening to podcasts. And to this day, I burned through many long-format episodes, the shortest probably being around 1.5 hours per episode. I love it. Podcasts allow me to use time I would otherwise waste, like driving to and from work or exercising at home or cooking or something like that, to learn about all sorts of things. How dopamine works in the brain, how cultures are formed, how real human connection happens, the darkest experiences of war and the most beautiful moments of people finding their meaning. Listening to podcasts is a lovely way to learn from many different people. Some of my personal favorites are from Andrew Huberman, Jocko Willink and Lex Fridman, and I'll even go for my occasional Joe Rogan. Podcasts are amazing, and I believe that by combining listening to podcasts, reading and learning and having great exploratory conversations with all sorts of people, you put yourself in the best possible position to develop yourself. And in doing so, become more useful to your community, however large or small that community may be. So I knew I would love to have a podcast to discuss ideas with people, just like the folks I mentioned earlier did on theirs. It sounded incredibly fun, but there are many risks attached that are really worth considering. Not only are you publishing yourself and your voice, and keep in mind, nothing ever gets forgotten on the internet, so a mistake can be very costly. But you also open yourself up to all kinds of different risks. It can impact your social environment. People who disagree with you may not want anything to do with you anymore. It could affect your social network, your friends, your loved ones, your job, your entire livelihood basically. Putting yourself out there is not a choice to be taken lightly, especially when you're delving into topics like psychology and psychoanalysis, war, religion, neurological disorders, and real human trauma. Subjects that are, by their very nature, incredibly sensitive and revealing, and sometimes incredibly polarizing as well. Making the decision to start a podcast took me years. Some more active than others, but years nonetheless. But in July 2024, I finally made the call and got the podcast going. Okay, with that bit of background in mind, let's talk about what's currently in the oven for the podcast. There are a few things going on. Up until now, most of my guests came from my regular circles. They either reached out to me through the contact form that's available in the description under every episode, or I reached out to them. These have been great ways to connect with all sorts of people from all over the world. And now I'm looking to supplement that in order to bring you even more interesting episodes. That's why I've started reaching out directly to experts from all kinds of different fields, with a few already planned. This new approach means you'll start hearing an even broader range of voices. You can still expect those wonderful personal stories that we've had on the podcast so far, but you can also look forward to the occasional expert who will shed light on their specific area of expertise. I believe this conversation will add a level of context, analysis, and educational insight to the podcast, something I'm personally very excited about. So far, everything is going great, and there are some really interesting conversations on the horizon, so keep an eye out on that. You do not want to miss out what's coming next. I also would like to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who's listening to the podcast. It's a pleasure every single time to make these episodes for you, and I hope you find them useful. If there's anything you think that should be improved, definitely let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to really consider it. If you want to support the podcast, a very simple and zero-cost way of doing so is to either subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or to follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Doing so would not only give me a very clear signal that you really enjoy what we're doing, but it also directly motivates me to work as hard as I possibly can for you to give you the best possible conversations I could possibly make. But before anything else, let me be very clear by giving you, again, a huge thank you for listening. Having your ear means the world, and I don't take it for granted. Alright, back to the episode. On the collaboration front, there are a few things to mention. My wonderful wife, Kate van Leeuwen, has joined the team as per episode 18 as the co-producer of the show. Together, we are formulating a plan to improve the quality of the podcast, and we've come up with a few ideas, thanks in large to the feedback we've received from all of you. So again, for that, a huge thank you. So the first one is a technical one. We're using a podcasting platform to record our conversations, which also lets us edit the conversations afterwards with its built-in editor. This is where Kate edits the conversation, export it as a video file, and then hands it over to me. I then use that file to create the final episode in our professional video editing software, and that is also where we create the preview reel that you hear at the beginning of every guest conversation, as well as where we assemble the rest of the intro, the final part of each episode, and add necessary transitions, musical elements, or effects. The reason I'm outlining this is that if you've been listening closely to our past episodes, you might have noticed that the sound and video quality of the intros and the outros are better than that of the actual conversation. That's because the exported file from our podcasting platform has both compressed video and audio files, a technical limitation of that platform. This isn't something we can fix within that system. The only solution is to work with the raw files, the original video and audio recordings, and edit the entire conversation in our professional video editing software. We are in the process of moving towards this, but it will take some time. Once we make that jump though, you will instantly notice a substantial improvement in both video and audio quality. Plus, it will give us a lot more flexibility on the editing front as well. We expect this transition to take a few more months. But moving away from editing directly on the podcasting platform will definitely be a wonderful upgrade once that is complete. The second improvement is what I'm personally incredibly excited about, and it will be implemented very soon. Our very own music. So far, we've been using a combination of licensed and royalty-free music, including in the episode that you're now listening to. And while this works perfectly fine, it lacks one major thing. Its own unique sound that you can instantly recognize as part of this podcast. That's why we have partnered up with a wonderful classical trained musician and music composer who has previously created original music for films, including one produced by Netflix. I won't announce their name at this moment, but the new music will be introduced very soon. And from that point on forward, we'll most likely no longer use any other form of music. And man, it is really, really, really good. I've heard the final version that was delivered recently and it's absolutely divine. I'm incredibly excited to finally share this wonderful new music with you very soon, and I'm sure it will greatly enhance the overall quality of every single episode. Plus, we aimed for a long-term relationship with this wonderful person that extends well into the future. So any music that we might need in the future, for example, because we need a specific track for an intro or because the conversation itself demands a very specific sound, that should be covered, which is absolutely amazing. The last thing I want to mention is that we have an intention to build a dedicated studio for the show, probably somewhere later in the year. That will also be the perfect time to upgrade our gear, especially our lighting. We've heard your feedback on this. Our lighting isn't always where it should be, and while I think it's better now than it was in the earlier video episodes, there is still a lot of room for improvement. Specifically with the lighting, by the way, we're obviously not waiting for the studio, but we will implement some improvements not too far into the future. Alright, so let's wrap this up. To summarize, Kate has joined the team as co-producer of the show. We are adopting a new guest outreach strategy to increase the range of topics discussed on the podcast. We are working on improving the quality of both the video and the audio by moving away from editing the actual conversation directly on the podcasting platform, which also will automatically give us way more flexibility when it comes to the entire editing process. We have partnered up with a wonderful classically trained musician and music composer to create original and recognizable music, which will be introduced very soon. We're aiming for a dedicated recording studio later in the year, and we'll be implementing lighting improvements not too far into the future. So that's all that's going on at the moment. It has been a few weeks since we've had a guest conversation on the podcast, but you can expect a lot more coming to you very soon. I hope to see you then. Thank you for listening, and as always, take care.